Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at D1Baseball.com. I'm your host, Joe Healy, joined as always by my good friend and co-host, Mark Etheridge. Today we're going to talk a little about some of the news that came out of ABCA last weekend. I was there and did some good networking. That's always fun, but also there was some business. There was some NCAA Tournament Selection Committee business that got kind of, some of it, frankly, got dropped in our laps. Some of it was stuff that, we maybe had been talked about, but we're going to kind of unpack all that, talk about what it means specifically from an SEC standpoint, obviously, but really just kind of generally to give you an idea of what all that's going to mean. So that's going to be the main crux of the show today. But before we get into any of that, I have to let you know that this episode of Highway to Hoover and every episode of Highway to Hoover is brought to you by Pitch Logic, the system used by players, coaches, scouts, and instructors at all levels of play, from youth leagues to the big leagues. The easy-to-use and affordable technology makes the platform accessible to every player at every level. All the metrics and features used at the highest level. See pitchlogic.com for more information. PitchLogic also at ABCA. Good booth setup they had there for PitchLogic at ABCA, in addition to a number of other folks who advertise with us at D1 Baseball. It was great to see some of those folks. Before we get to the topic of the day here, Mark, are you or are you not going to be Alabama's next head coach?
I cannot hold your feet to the fire or deny at this point.
When they do find,
wasn't that some news, man?
That would be some news. Are they going to, when they decide on a coach, is it kind of like when they elect a new pope and there's the smoke coming out? There's like crimson colored smoke coming out of the Malmore complex.
Yeah, don't rule it out. I mean, this is more important than popage. I mean, this is SEC football, right? I mean, this is it's often been compared to religion, and I think that's what you're going to see, because my daughter's at Alabama. She's a student. She's a senior there. And she explained, I mean, it was like a funeral up there. I mean, people were just so, especially, if you're that age, because that's really all your memories. Okay. Saban is Alabama football to you.
That's fair. Yeah.
And it was definitely she said, like a surreal deal. Right. So that's obviously the biggest story in the SEC, for now. And who knows, where they'll land. Certainly there's a lot of money. It's an attractive job, but who wants to follow that guy? I mean, there is only one direction, and it is not up. Okay. So it's a great job. It's going to pay you a lot of money, and you're going to have everything you need to win, but you better win.
Yeah, it's first of all, it was the most Nick Saban thing ever that, reportedly he had like a normal work day with like meetings and interviewing like position coaches or whatever, and then was like, hey, by the way, I'm retiring. See you guys. Yeah. And then he's just gone. And it's like, okay, see you, man. Yeah, just very, very Nick Saban. But you're right about, I mean, two things that I think are related here. You mentioned, you're having a daughter at Bama who's a senior, and her whole life has been Nick Saban being the coach at Alabama. Relatedly, I think young people kind of forget, and I don't need to remind you, Mark, but young people kind of forget,
not one of those,
like the 90s and early 2000s were not kind to Alabama football.
Yeah. Alabama fans sat through the mics. Okay.
Yeah.
It was one problem after another. There were some really lean years. There were some decent years. I mean, I think the stat is every Alabama football coach from Brian on has had a 10-win season, which, it's kind of surprising, right? Other than Mike Price, he had a different kind of 10. But it was but the point is, you can win there. There is, but once Saban came in, he really elevated it. He got the administration behind him, everybody pointing in the same direction. They got all the facility upgrades and all those cool things that draw in recruits. And then he was able to develop, once he got there. And, it's kind of, to segue into baseball, we see that, with the SEC, that with all of the money and all the facility upgrades, and how that has affected being able to recruit nationally, where you're not just bringing in people from your home base, you're able to recruit nationally. And that's what, that's what Alabama and what Georgia and LSU and others are doing. But it's all about putting them in a situation where they feel like that they can better themselves, and that's certainly, what happened at Alabama.
Yeah, Mark, you tried to eloquently segue us into baseball. I'm going to drive us right back into the ditch real
Mhm.
quick because I just looked at a list on Wikipedia the Alabama football seasons, year by year. The
Yeah.
real upset here, you're right. Like, every coach, going back to Bear has had a 10-win season. There's some real upsets in here, like Bill Curry. Um, managed in 3 years to have one
Yeah.
10-win season.
I
Or my
lost to
favorite,
Auburn all 3 years, and that was
D
not
well,
happening.
that's
Was
yeah, that doesn't work. The real upset though, Dennis Francione, 2002 managed to go 10-3, and just to give people an idea of how much things have changed since that time, which was not that long ago. We're talking 20
Yeah.
years ago. You know, he left, was not fired, left to go to Texas A&M, and I will also remind you that was
Yeah.
a Big 12 Texas A&M that doesn't have all the bells and whistles that it has
Yeah. I have
right
a
now.
story about that.
Oh, really? Okay.
I was on the beat at Alabama as a football reporter and other things there, and I went to Hawaii, where Alabama played Hawaii to end Franchone's um, stint there. We interviewed him and we asked him about because there were rumors, but nobody really believed he was leaving, right? And we asked him about his postseason plans, and he's talking about, recruiting and off-season conditioning and all of these other things. So I'm like, all right, so nothing's happening, right? So my wife was with me. We go to the beach. You're in Hawaii, you're trying to take a few days on the back end of it. We get to the airport after our stay and look up, and there it is scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Of course, this was pre-cell phone days, but scrolling across the bottom of the screen, Franchione leaving for Texas A&M. And I had just talked to the guy like 2 days ago, right, about his plans, and it just, that's the way things happen there. And in that instance, and you think about today, where if something like that happens, immediately, right? There's no delay. There's no chance to keep something quiet. Um, it's just a whole different world, and it's really not that long ago.
No doubt. Yeah, it'll be interesting because that they part of the magic of Saban was getting everyone at Alabama to sing out of the same songbook,
Hmm.
and the next guy may not
Good
have
luck.
that cachet.
Yeah.
Yeah, so almost surely will not have that cachet. So that'll be certainly interesting to monitor. All right, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's talk some baseball and talk a little bit about mostly some NCAA tournament stuff. Before we talk specifically about ABCA, Mark,
Hmm.
since you and I last chatted in this medium anyway, you put out a Q&A about the DSR. We've talked about the DSR. That, of course, for
Yeah.
those who haven't listened to that episode where we introduced it, is the Diamond Sports rating or ranking. I should know that.
Hmm.
But regardless, we talked about the DSR as I like scramble to look it up here.
I think it's rating.
Uh, ranking.
It is ranking.
Yeah,
Okay.
Diamond Sports ranking. Apologies to our friends at 643 Charts. Anyway, the DSR, we introduced it a couple weeks ago. It is an RPI alternative that our friends at 643 Charts developed. And so Mark and I introduced it. If you want to listen to an interview with some folks from 643 Charts, the main D1 baseball podcast did that a couple weeks ago.
Hmm.
But Mark also put out late last week a Q&A based off a conversation that Mark and I had offline with folks at 643 Charts and kind of went over some questions that you, the listener, the college baseball fan, probably would have had
Yeah.
about the DSR as it relates, comparisons to RPI and really just kind of the idea behind doing this. So first off, Mark, tell us how you would sell that piece to a reader, but then if you don't mind, kind of give us a feel for, now that you've looked under the hood a little more at DSR, what
Hmm.
an SEC fan needs to know about it that
Yeah.
might be a little bit different than what we're used to.
Yeah. Well, I guess first off, it was great to nerd out a little bit and go in and talk about the numbers behind it and how the ratings come together and the components, right? So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, we really went deep into we talked to Rick and Forrest there at 643, and they went through how they landed on the different components and how they weighted those, right? So for the, because you want to incorporate, how good your wins are, how strong your opponents are, um, but also they wanted to incorporate some other things as well. Um, the where the games are played, which the RPI also considers, but also like the game of the week, right? Or the day of the week is a win on Tuesday equal to a win on Friday when you think about in our sport how the pitchers are different? Well, it may not be, and and this will measure it. But one of the things I wanted to know is what's going to really bring big swings and volatility to ratings, right? Because we've seen it. You play a bad team, you win the game, and you drop 7-8 points or sometimes more, right? So it and I don't think anybody really thinks that's a you played and you won. Why did you drop so much, right? Why is that even a possibility? And that's a reality with the RPI. So and so what they wanted to do is it's a zero sum game. So each each game is worth the you think about it as one. You're either gonna win one or part of that one or lose part of that one based on the probability of winning and losing. So the byproduct of that, and I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but the byproduct of that is you're never going to have a benefit from not playing, from canceling a game. Okay. And I guess we'll get into this later, but the NCAA chose not to quote penalize teams for the cancellation. They didn't really like the details of how that worked out. And as a I don't know that there's a good way to do it based on how the RPI is built. I mean, it would be strictly a penalty. We're going to dock you X amount, but then how do you evaluate whether that's a true cancellation for for valid reasons versus for RPI gaming purposes, right? So to get back on track, I think one of the big things I like about it is it's going to, based on the probability of winning a game or losing a game, you're going to take the points from the team you beat, and you're going to lose points from the team that beat you. Okay, so that part I really like. It does not weight strength of schedule as much. And we go into the details. If you go read the piece, you'll kind of get an idea of how that works. Um, and as a result, um, uh, they don't they don't weight the road bonuses and the home penalties as much because the thought was that was really a reaction to how much strength of schedule is weighted in the RPI. And I thought that was an interesting point. What I'm curious about is how that will play out over the course of watching it, this year, because now we're going to get to evaluate these tools side by side as the year goes on. So that's obviously a pretty interesting opportunity, right? Because all of these, um, all the DSR ratings are going to be on D1 baseball. They're going to have a user interface where you can go in, you can see how it tracked based on based on a win, based on a loss, based on the opponent, all of that, and you'll be able to see it and see how it was affected from day to day, which is really difficult to do, with the RPI because it's in today's world, it's so based on what your opponents and your opponents do versus what you do. And, just from a intellectual standpoint, I kind of like being in control of my own destiny and not being um, you know, so tied up in how other people do after I played them. I play them in week one, and then week 50, or not week, but game 50, they're terrible now when they were pretty good early in the year, right? So all of those factors DSR tries to account for where the RPI really can't. So that part I'm interested in. I do think that at this point, and we'll get into this kind of with the ABCA stuff, but I don't know that the RPI can quote be fixed in its current state, the way the current formula. I think it needs to be replaced, and whether it's the DSR, whether it's something else, right? I think we're at the point now where we're having some serious conversations that may actually be, something we have always wondered, would we ever do this? And I think that day is getting close. I really do.
Momentum is certainly there. I think that that is kind of one of my biggest takeaways from, I mean, really, it's just been the last few weeks, whether it was DSR or whether we'll talk about the KPI here shortly, but a couple of points you made there. I think we can all agree, like, a bare minimum requirement for whatever comes next is eliminating the motivation to cancel games for no good reason.
Yeah.
I think that's on all sides, right? Because if you're a low major team that knows your RPI is going to stink, like, that sucks, because you just kind of know that it's going to be hard for us to get games in May against, teams that are typically postseason teams. And then if you're obviously the team chasing the postseason, like, that's not a fun phone call to make, right? I mean, it's just awkward, and that's got to be tough. And, but it kind of is what it is. And so, with the DSR, it does disincentivize that. And, I think Mike Rooney brought up the hypothetical offline to us, like in a group chat, about, and he wasn't saying it would necessarily be a bad thing, but he's like, is an unintended consequence of this that teams will just start fishing around for better games? And, like, I think the short answer is yes, maybe, but also I think that how many of those are there going to be? Because coaches don't really want to change the schedule on the fly, but they're in a position where they feel like they have to.
Right.
So sure, could you maybe schedule a better midweek game occasionally? Like, perhaps, I mean, maybe what you end up seeing instead is just teams leaving more open dates for midweeks late in the year, and they maybe either play them or they don't, depending on who they can get. You
get a rain out in February and you just don't fill it, and then in May you have that opportunity, right? You have that extra game.
So maybe we'll see some of that. You also bring up the stress that comes with, you play a team in February and then you have to cross your fingers that team is good. It reminds me of one of Jay Johnson's years at Arizona, where, or maybe it was Nevada, one of the two, when he was at Nevada or Arizona, and they missed the postseason. They had a bunch of games lined up in conference. I think it was Nevada, actually. A bunch of games lined up late in the year against top 50 RPI teams, and they did really well in that stretch. Well, but because they won those games, those teams dropped out of the top 50 of the RPI. And it's like dropping from 47 to 55 is not a material difference.
Right.
But on the team sheet, like, unless the selection committee is really locked in on what happened there, it's just not going to be reflected. So that is always frustrating. So anyway, long story short.
Well, I mean, the RPI, go ahead, finish your point.
I was just going to say, cleaning up those couple of things, the scheduling piece and the not being so tied to what happens next for your opponents, I think are a couple of just really good bullet points of things that they're trying to focus on.
Yeah, I would agree. And, the RPI tiers, right? And that's something that they're going to kind of look at. But still, I mean, you have to have a cutoff somewhere. So there's always going to be that possibility of beating somebody and they slide right beyond the tier. And that's the challenging part. It's almost like you need a floating tier, right? Because what makes 25 the right number? What makes 50 the right number? I've always thought about there needs to be a pool of teams that we call the, team A and team B and team C. And it's not based on any kind of hard number, right? It moves based on, hey, here's the cutoff. And of course that's subjective, and you would need to have someone who could put that in there, but then it's not arbitrary, right? It's not 1 through 25, and 26 might not be any different than 22, right? So it's those kinds of things that make this really challenging.
So let's talk about a couple of things that we've alluded to. Let's start with the change in the quad system, because we were just kind of talking about that. And so before we start this part of the conversation, I feel like I should give the disclaimer up top, because there was some confusion about this. when I wrote about this for the site, but there has been no change in how the RPI is calculated for 2024. Flatly, it's the same. However, what we're talking about here is, and this is more terminology more commonly used in basketball, quad 1 wins, quad 2 wins, quad 3, quad 4. That exists in baseball, but we tend to group them more like top 50, top 100, what have you. But the quads do show up on the team sheets that the committee is given when they're deliberating to build the field. And so that does matter. So a couple of things here. Typically, or previously, the quads were split up just based on RPI. So 1 through 25, 26 through 50, 51 to 100, and then 101 plus. Now, at first blush, 101 plus being quad 4 is pretty harsh. I mean, like there could be some good teams that play in just not good leagues that are tough customers that are 120 in RPI, right? So like that feels weird to begin with, but I won't read a whole bunch of numbers here. You can go to d1baseball.com, read my piece from ABCA, because I don't want to lose you just reading a bunch of numbers here. But basically, long story short, is they've now broken up the RPI based on if things are home, neutral, or road. I'll just give you one example. Instead of quad 1 being just flatly 1 through 25 in RPI, quad 1 home game is anything against RPI 1 through 25. If you play it on a neutral site, it's RPI 1 through 40. And if you play a road game versus RPI 1 through 60, it's a quad 1 win. And it kind of just filters on down through there. It does what the RPI kind of does, which is give a little bit of grace to road games and neutral site games, which makes some sense on its face. What's your reaction there, Mark? How do you think this could materially affect anything having to do with the SEC?
I think it's double counting. I mean, I really do, because you're already giving the road bonus and the home penalty in the RPI itself. And then you're using those exact same numbers to tweak the quads even more. Okay. So it's really giving you the impotence to go schedule road games. Okay. And as in this league, you look down the list, and I've got a piece on this coming up. There's just several teams in this league very seldom will leave home, especially in midweek. All right. So, and if they go in, even in pre-conference weekends, there's one neutral site weekend maybe, and that's it. Right. There's not road games. So I think that was my first thought. Okay. The other is, okay, you just changed this and everyone's schedule has already been made. Okay. So as far as I know, this was just released. I feel like I keep up pretty close, and I didn't know about this. So I don't know if coaches had any kind of heads up that this was coming, but their schedules the cake's already in the oven now. You can't change the ingredients at this point, at least not very much. Right. So that was surprising. I do think that it's going to reward teams that are able to have road success. And now you don't even have to have road success against, the top 25 anymore, the top 50 anymore. You just need road success, because really, you read off the numbers. I mean, for a quad 1 road game, 1 through 60, but even quad 2, it's under 120. Okay. And then road 3, or for quad 3, it's under 240 on the road. You can certainly pick up some quad 3 wins, and just to correlate that, that's 51 to 100 at home. Okay. So it counts the same. Beating 240 on the road counts the same as 51 at home. Okay. Those are not equivalent teams. Not in anyone's vocabulary are those equivalent. So I don't know the reason it was done, but it seemed to me it wasn't that well thought out. I would love for someone who involved in that process to give me a holler.
Yeah, text Mark Etheridge if you have more information on a couple of funny things there is, one is I like the idea of, quad 4 road games being against anybody, worse than 241 in the RPI, it seems almost impossible for an SEC team to play a road game against someone that low in RPI.
It's not built with the
Like,
SEC in mind for quad
well, for
4.
sure.
Certainly
Yeah.
with quad
No.
1, it is. That's
Yeah.
absolutely
But
what that's about.
it's also interesting in quad 2 that, you mentioned, anybody under 161 through 120 in RPI on the road is a quad 2 game, so let's say you're playing an RPI 115 team on the road. That's a quad 2 win or loss, whereas it would have been a quad 4 in the previous. Yeah. And that's kind of stands out to me that a win can move, 2 levels up from what it previously was. That's a pretty significant jump.
Yeah, it does. I think the thought behind the change, I understand. I mean, you're trying to give more opportunities to different people, and all these big leagues are, they had half the host sites and half the top 8s, and you're trying to do some things to combat that. But how you did it, I mean, the application of it is what I have a problem with. So one thing though that is kind of interesting is I am pleased, and we sort of alluded to this earlier, that there's at least conversation about making some changes. There's some openness to it, where before it was like, we don't RPI, we at least understand it, so it's the devil we know, okay, and we're not going to look at anything else. Well, at least now you're trying something, even though I wasn't crazy about this. They opened up the possibility about using the KPI in the measurement, which we can talk about that more. That is not something that I was really familiar with. I'd kind of seen it alluded to in hoops, but I really hadn't paid attention to it. So I did some numbers. I looked at it compared to RPI, even looked at it compared to DSR, shared that with you guys, and just I don't know that it's that materially different. I do think that one of the concepts of the DSR that separates it from the other two is it's going to rank teams by who would be favored by its rating system. Okay. So, on a neutral field, 1 is favored over 2, 2 over 3, and so on. As we've seen with the RPI, that is not the case, right? You'll have, we all feel the number 20 team is better than, the number 2 team sometimes. Okay. And that's, that's flawed, especially when you have a committee that's been so reliant. We all joke about it when they go to the at-large teams. They just pick the candidates, right? The ones that meet a minimum criteria, and then they just sort by RPI, and that's who they take. Because if you go down the list of teams that were really serious contenders that didn't have some other flaw that disqualified them, that's who they took, right? So having a rating system that does rank them in a probability to win is appealing for as someone who has watched the committee, kind of, put it in a spreadsheet. We've all done the thing, or you put it in the spreadsheet and sort, low to high. Okay. Well, if you're going to do that anyway, let's have something that picks based on probability to win. Who would win the game, right? But then that goes into the whole deal of, because the RPI looks back. So it's measuring what you've, quote, accomplished, where this is a probability of winning a game, right? So those are measuring 2 different things. It includes that as one of the components, to get to that output or the final number. But it's this whole thing of most deserving versus best. We went through this ad nauseum with football this year, right? So it's trying to determine that. And that's what the DSR is trying to do. And I like the concept. We'll find out if, how well they do it. But that is attractive, right? To be able to pull off something like that, if that does materialize.
So the other thing that came up at ABCA was, you've alluded to it a couple times now, is that the KPI has entered the chat.
Yeah.
And this was really truly got dropped in our laps. I mean, the quad thing did too, but that's like just a tweak to existing data. So but the KPI was, I had probably the most common conversation I had at ABCA's coaches asking me like, did you know this was coming? And I'm like, I was going to ask you the same question. And it just seems like, I mean, obviously somebody knew it was coming, but most coaches I talked to had no idea. And if you're a college basketball fan, you might be a little bit familiar with the KPI. You could research it yourself if you want to know the nuts and bolts of it. We'll skip that part here because it's not great audio, but understand two things. One is that it is a system not dissimilar from the stuff we're talking about here, and that it does have some proof of concept. College basketball has been using it for, a long time now, more than a decade, I think. So it is something that's a little bit tried and true. It's not necessarily a beta test kind of situation. So there is that. But here's the part, Mark, before we get into like anything else about it, here's the way in the manual we were given at ABCA, here's the way it was phrased as to how this will be used. I wrote this in my story. I'm just going to read from my story real quick. According to the information provided at Thursday's meeting, quote, the KPI will not be used as a selection criterion. However, the committee plans to use this results-based metric as a resource in the selection meeting when evaluating teams. What does that mean? Like, how can something, and I'm sure there is an explanation for this, but it seems to me that is a distinction without a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, we can parse the words. If I had to play wordsmith, I would say it's going to be there in the room. We're not telling you have to use it, but it's there to refer to if to help break ties or whatever, right? That was, and I think that's what that means. That's what I read from it. I think the bigger message from that though is that we realize that there's been enough hoorah over the RPI that we need to do something. And this is a step in that direction. And whether it's, whether it's the KPI, whether it's trying to continue to tweak the RPI, which I think is a losing proposition, or there's something else. And maybe DSR, maybe it's some other thing we don't even know about right now. So I think that's where we're heading. And I applaud it. I mean, I think that's a good thing. Because it's, if you're going to be this reliant, and don't get me wrong, I think you need to be reliant on some sort of objective metric because there's so little interconnectivity between the different parts of the country, and now leagues are getting even bigger, right? So you're going to have teams within the same leagues that don't have that many common opponents, okay, because of how things have migrated. So it's going to be, I think they're going to be less reliable, not more. And as a result, it needs to be as good as it can be.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point so my hunch is that this KPI thing, and this is not inside information, this is just Joe's, kind of read on it, is that the KPI being used as let's just call it an unofficial metric, a data point, is either a reaction to the DSR being out there and creating conversation, or if not that, then a result of a conversation that also led to the DSR being created. Could be either of those things. But to your point, it does suggest there is an acknowledgement that, hey, we need to try to explore options beyond the RPI. And that is a good thing. Like, I think above all else, no matter what we land on here, like, at least we're having the conversation. And I think we inherently understand that it's probably going to be some time, right? This is not going to roll out 12 months from now, I wouldn't think, like a new metric. Like, this is going to take some time and some shaping and some debate and some legislation, and those things kind of move slow. We always want bureaucracy to move faster than it does. So we'll just have to kind of be patient with that. But I think all positive things that we're at least having this conversation.
Yeah, I agree. And I do think that with, I'm careful how I word this, but with public comments, from John Cohen last year about the RPI not really, being all things to all people, that that sometimes is referred to. I think that is why we have the KPI this year. And I also think that if the DSR had been around last year, there was an opportunity, because this is brand new. It hasn't even been through a full season live, right? We haven't even seen a version 1 of it. Okay. This is all prototyping until we have some new games and watch it as it builds. I think it had an opportunity or still has an opportunity to be that replacement as it goes forward in some version of it. All right, version 2, version 3, however as it continues to go. Because you know how it is when you build something, you very seldom get everything right the first time, right? You learn as you go and you prototype it and you build and build and build and you're agile about it, and you're able to get to a piece at the end that everybody's happy. And that's what we're going to be able to see with it, and have these other tools to compare it to. And that's a big part of what we'll do all year. We'll take a small subset, say the SEC, and we'll watch it, right? Watch it with those 14 teams and see how it looks every week. So that'll be part of our journey.
Indeed. And the beauty of it, if you're an SEC fan, and I say this at the end as opposed to at the top of this episode, because I didn't want to undermine the discussion, but the beauty of it, if you're an SEC fan, is that these are margin cases, right? The bottom line in the SEC is if you win enough SEC games, you're probably fine. Whatever it is you want to do, get in the postseason, host a regional, be a top 8, all of that. You win enough SEC games, you're fine. This is not the Sun Belt, where you have to have some things go your way, and you have to schedule just so, all that kind of stuff. And that's, that frustrates, and I understand the frustration. That frustrates people outside of the SEC. And look, I think we can all understand why that's frustrating for someone outside of that group. However, if you are a fan of an SEC club, it largely remains true that if you just mostly take care of business within the league, you're going to be fine. Now, it's easier said than done, obviously, but that is kind of the reality of the situation. So that has not changed.
One other point is, with the quads, this is already enacted. All right. So we're going to use this year. So that's going to change how we all look at the tiers and how this goes. So one of the pieces that we're working on is for part of the season preview, SEC season preview, is we're going to take a look at what each of the 14 teams' schedules look like based on last year's RPI and this year's quads, right? So you kind of see what, based on how the quote intended strength of schedule would be in a quad realm. So just kind of some interesting things. Missouri, all 30 of their SEC teams are quad 1, right? They're the only one. You have some that, may only have 18 quad 1 games, right, where all of theirs are. And so it's just kind of one of those things where your road games were against the teams with the worst RPIs, and your home games are against the teams with the higher RPIs. It's still, and you aren't guaranteed that those are going to be the best teams this year, as we've seen the last couple of years, where the defending champs didn't even make, defending national champs didn't make conference tournament the following year. We'll see if LSU can break that streak. Pretty confident they will. But those are the kinds of things that we'll look at. We've got tons of stuff planned, but we're already working on it. We're trying to get some of the final nuances toned. And at that point, it's going to be really fun to follow, just because it's different, right? So we'll take us all just a little bit of time to understand, how those quad setups are going to play out. Maybe it's much ado about nothing. Maybe it stays pretty common, or maybe there's some actual real changes. And when we look at things counting twice, really giving credence to road wins, maybe that's going to be a big thing for teams that scheduled aggressively, when the Kentucky from last year, or the Indiana State in the past. I think it's going to help those kind of clubs even more, because of those opportunities. And the teams that play all the home games, we're going to see how much it hurts them.
Yeah, you led us right to the doorstep there, Mark. A good opportunity now to talk a little bit about, just quickly, like we're closing out this episode, but stuff we have coming up. Mark and I have been working in our little editorial calendar. I can tell you we got a lot of fun stuff coming up. We kind of have a soft launch of preview week next week. Mark has a whole series of features that I won't totally spoil here, but there's some individual program stuff. There's a lot of big picture stuff, which I think is cool. He's been working on these things and kind of marinating these for a while. So that's kind of a soft launch to preview stuff. And then the week of the 22nd of January is when we start to roll out our individual preview pieces. So here's what you can expect for each individual SEC club. You will get the following: a podcast episode, about 15 minutes, that kind of just breaks down the team. That's pretty straightforward. You will get a schedule analysis piece from Mark that will just kind of lay out, how the schedule breaks and how it affects, postseason hopes or whatever that program is trying to do. You will get an individual piece from me on 5 breakout players potentially for each program. And then you'll get a piece that Mark and I are going to work on together, called a preseason snapshot. So in this piece, we'll do like a little blurb at the top, like state of the program. We'll have the team's projected lineup in there. We'll have questions to answer. I'll list a series of
Top
questions that are
storylines, right?
Yeah, top storylines from Mark. We'll have little bits on here's how things could go right, here's how things could go wrong. So that preseason snapshot is going to be a little bit of a potpourri of things, if you will, to get you ready for the season. So a lot of individual stuff coming your way over the next few weeks. So if you're just listening to this on your favorite podcasting app and you are not subscribed to SEC Extra, now would be the time to do it, honestly. And, obviously Mark and I have skin in the game. And so, yes, we're saying that for that reason, but also that's just true. I mean, if you're going to get in, now is the time to do it, because you'll get all the preview content over the next month leading up to opening day, which is in about 5 weeks. Not that long. So you want to make sure you're ready for that. So,
and honestly, there's nowhere out here, nowhere that you're going to find dedicated content on, all SEC teams like this, right? This much and, disconnected, because we're not just writing this, based on our own knowledge. These are through interviews with coaches and other sources that we're able to put this together.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, everything pretty heavily reported and researched, and you can bet that Mark and I have been working hard in the lab on all this stuff. So we would be humbled, honestly, if you would join us. Go over to d1baseball.com, click the SEC Extra tab at the top of the page, and subscribe. Give us a year to win your business for the second year. You can still use the code FALL20 to get 20% off of your annual subscription, or prescription. Yeah, it'll make you feel better. It helps you in the dreary months of January and early February. It'll bring a little sunshine to you. That's what I'm prescribing if you subscribe to SEC Extra.
I like it.
Yeah, take a little wordplay there, if you will, to wrap up this podcast. That will do it for this edition of Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at d1baseball.com. Thank you to Pitch Logic for sponsoring this and every episode of Highway to Hoover. Thank you, as always, to Mark, and thank you, the listener, for listening. We'll talk